I was at home, my home office, and I got a call from Daniel Zwerdling of NPR, who was a friend of mine, neighbor, friend. He was the anchor for Weekend All Things Considered.
Right.
He said, Rabin's been shot. Can you go on the air? I'm sitting on the phone, recovering from that shock, and I went on the air and we talked a lot. Danny is a brilliant radio person. He and I do a podcast together. And he put together a show just, with no preparation, basically. He won an award for that. That all came back to me. I hadn't thought about that for quite a while.
That's really interesting.
It all came back to me at this moment.
We'll try to piece together, because you knew Rabin, on that, what did you say and what went through your head as you thought about this man's life and how it was taken prematurely?
I have no idea what I said.
Right.
But I can tell you a few things about, the word no might be a little grand for, my interactions with him. I was a journalist and I interviewed him 2 or 3 times. The first time I met him was an unusual situation. I had been in Moscow for 4 years, and I came to Jerusalem. I was there for a couple of months, and the phone rang in my office, and there was a man on the other end who said, can we meet? And I said, well, who is this? And he said, I can't say. I said, well, what's it about? He said, I can't say. And I said, I thought I'd left Moscow. But I did meet him, and he turned out to be a gentleman named Peretz Kidron, who had translated Rabin's memoirs into English, and was very upset that the censorship committee, which was headed by the justice minister, to which all former officials had to submit manuscripts, had deleted a passage in which Rabin described the expulsion of Palestinians from Lod and Ramla, 2 towns near Tel Aviv, during the 48 War.
Whose book was it?
This was Rabin's book, Rabin's memoir. And Peretz Kidron had translated it. So he was the translator. He gave me the manuscript. He was upset by the deletion. And I thought, well, this is really interesting, because I had just, as I said, been in the Soviet Union, where I got very interested in the manipulation of history, which the Soviets did extensively. And so here we were in Israel, an open society, where some historical event in a major turning point in creation of Israel really had been suppressed when it was written about by a former prime minister, former chief of staff, who was commander of Palmach in the 48 War. So I thought this is an interesting story, but I had no idea whether it was true. I didn't know Peretz Kidron. I didn't know whether the manuscript was real. I had to check with Rabin. And so I got in touch with Rabin and invited myself to meet with him, and I went down to his office in Tel Aviv, which was...
What was his position at the time?
He was in the opposition. Menachem Begin was the prime minister. He was in the Likud. The Labor Party was in the opposition, and the head of the Labor Party was Shimon Peres. Rabin really, at that time, was not a very prominent political actor in Israeli politics. So I went to see him, and he was in his very sparse office, and he was chain smoking, and I put a tape recorder on his desk, and I said, he said, well, this is the first time we've met. Let's just do this on background. And I said, okay, but I have one question I have to ask you on the record, because I needed to confirm that this manuscript was real, that he had actually written this. So I told him, I said, Peretz Kidron gave me this. He said he shouldn't have done that. And I said, well, he did, and can you tell me about it? He said, I can't talk about it. And I said, well, why do you think the censors took it out? And he said, I don't know, I was surprised. Bingo, I had the confirmation. He said, I gave them work to do. He said, I wrote stuff about our nuclear weapons. I knew they would take that out. But I'm surprised they took this out. Well, maybe he shouldn't have been surprised, because at that time, the official version in Israel was that no Palestinians were expelled deliberately. Those who left fled of their own accord, or to avoid the fighting, as people do in war, or had been encouraged by Arab leaders to leave pending an Arab victory, when they could presumably come back to their homes. So the Israeli, it wasn't in the textbooks, it wasn't in the common narrative of the 48 war. And it was suppressed. This is 1979. So I have the excerpt here. If you'd like me to read it to you, I will read it to you.
I think we have the record here.
It's not long.
Yeah.
The New York Times published it, and it's very interesting on a couple of ways, and you'll see it's revealing of not only of an historical event, but of Rabin's sensibilities. Here it is. Here's what he wrote. It was taken out of his memoir. While the fighting was still in progress, we had to grapple with a troublesome problem for whose solution we could not draw upon any previous experience. The fate of the civilian population of Lod and Ramla, numbering some 50,000. Not even Ben-Gurion could offer any solution. And during the discussions at operational headquarters, he remained silent, as was his habit in such situations. Clearly, we could not leave Lod's hostile and armed populace in our rear, where it would endanger the supply route to Yiftach, which was another brigade that was advancing eastward. We walked outside, Ben-Gurion accompanying us. Yigal Allon, later became foreign minister, repeated his question. What is to be done with the population? BG waved his hand in a gesture which said, drive them out. Allon and I held a consultation. I agreed that it was essential to drive the inhabitants out. We took them on foot toward the Beit Horon road, assuming that the Legion, meaning the Arab Legion, would be obliged to look after them, thereby shouldering logistic difficulties which would burden its fighting capacity, making things easier for us. Driving out is a term with a harsh ring. Psychologically, this was one of the most difficult actions we took. The population of Lod did not leave willingly. There was no way of avoiding the use of force and warning shots in order to make the inhabitants march the 10 to 15 miles to the point where they met up the Legion. The inhabitants of Ramle watched and learned the lesson. Their leaders agreed to be evacuated voluntarily, on condition that the evacuation was carried out by vehicles. Buses took them to Latrun, and from there they were evacuated by the Legion. Great suffering was inflicted upon the men taking part in the eviction action. Soldiers of the Yiftach Brigade included youth movement graduates who had been inculcated with values such as international fraternity and humaneness. The eviction action went beyond the concepts they were used to. There were some fellows who refused to take part in the expulsion action. Prolonged propaganda activities were required after the action to remove the bitterness of these youth movement groups and explain why we are obliged to undertake such a harsh and cruel action. This tells you that Rabin was as complicated as his country. He often felt that the great damage done by making war against the Arabs was also done to the Israelis. So, for example, after the 1967 war, he gave a speech in which he said, "We encounter again and again a strange phenomenon among the fighters. They cannot be fully happy. The fighters in the front line saw with their own eyes not just the glory of victory, but also its price. Their comrades fell next to them, covered by blood, and I know that the terrible price paid by the enemy has also deeply affected many of them. How interesting. Now, on the expulsions during the 48 war, about 5 years later, when foreign ministry documents from the period were declassified, an Israeli journalist turned historian named Benny Morris mined those documents and wrote a detailed book listing the villages from which Arabs were expelled according to the Israeli foreign ministry documents and how many. So it's well documented now. And it has crept into the Israeli textbooks. So in universities, students do study it. And it's not a central aspect of the history, but it's there. In high school, maybe less so. So anyway, that censorship of that terrible part of the war didn't hold, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
So what did you make of the portrait of Rabin that you saw in this play, and how does the complexity and the variety of impulses that you see in this characterization of the last month of Rabin's life, which is a much smaller trajectory than the grand scope of his military career. But what did you see in the play that in some ways strikes a familiar complexity to what you just shared?
Excuse me. Well, I did see the, some people said he's the pure Sabra. He's prickly on the outside, soft on the inside. Mm-hmm. You saw the soft part of it. You saw the yearning for peace. But the play also held that legacy of him as a warrior. Mm-hmm. He was a crusty guy. He was tough-minded, and I think even not wearing a bulletproof vest was emblematic of that. It's true, he refused to. So I think that it caught something. And of course, earlier on, you didn't, in his earlier years, you didn't see that softer part of him or that yearning as deep. For example, I was there during the 1982 war in Lebanon. And I remember Rabin being criticized, and he was in the opposition then, he was just a member of the Knesset. And he was criticized strongly for not opposing the war. That war generated a lot of opposition among Israelis in the end. And Rabin didn't oppose it. He had personal private misgivings about it, but he didn't publicize them. And he said, once in a war, you had to win it. And he also urged the army to tighten the siege of Beirut during that war, which was a position that got him a lot of criticism in public. But he did other things in the pursuit of peace later when he became prime minister for the second time in 1992, which were not in the play and are not really widely understood. He tried very hard to move along a peace track with Syria. He offered all kinds of concessions to Syria. He offered the return of the Golan Heights if Syria would normalize relations with Israel. President Hafez al-Assad, played games and wriggled here and there, but ultimately couldn't bring himself to that full acceptance of Israel. And so that torpedoed it, and Rabin was very frustrated by it. So that was a whole track of the peace process that didn't bear fruit, but was one he pursued quite vigorously for quite some time with the help of the U.S. I think that the paradox of Rabin is the paradox of Israel in a way. I mean that one of the lines in the play, which is very powerful, when you've got the debate going on between you know, the young
we're-
settler
yeah.
and the peace, you know, peace now woman, you know, what has it done to us? Which is a deep question that Israel has always faced, and now I think in even more dramatic terms. And I think that was also a motivation for Rabin. I think from what we know of him and what he wrote about and what he said, and especially in those later years, he was haunted by what constant war was doing to Israel. He was haunted by it. I always thought of him as having an altruist, what you might call an altruistic self-interest. That he was driven to realize how Israelis suffered by making Arabs suffer. He understood that hatred goes in two directions. So.
Wow. Well, we have an intimate audience with a great recorder of history and somebody who knows this area well. I want to open it up to you briefly for a question or reaction.
So there's a fascinating moment where Arafat calls Rabin, and then there's an interplay about uniforms. Arafat should take off his, and Rabin should put on his. Did they have a kind of personal relationship that would have allowed that, or what did you make of that moment in the play?
I love that scene, but I honestly don't know the answer to your question. This was whether they had that kind of personal relationship.
What we can share is the phone call is an invention of the writer, but it's based on reporting from David Makovsky of the Middle East Institute, who told Gershom Gorenberg, Myra Novak, the book writer's husband, that Arafat warned Rabin about the dangers of not wearing it, warned him about what would happen to Sadat could happen to Rabin too. So, and he even, Makovsky repeats in Arafat's dialect, I warned him. And so Myra took sort of that inspiration from it, and there was, ostensibly an exchange of New Year's cards at one point, and created a more theatrical rendering of that. So that's the origin of that scene.
Oh, great! That's great. It was great, and I think that we all remember. I think we're all old enough to remember that scene when Clinton had to kind of nudge Rabin to shake Arafat's hand, and it looked as if Rabin was, sort of felt he was touching something, disgusting. But they did it. It didn't work out, and Arafat, I think, was largely responsible, or partly responsible anyway, for it not succeeding in the end. Arafat was and I don't know that Rabin, I don't know how much Rabin understood Arafat, but I'm sure that Rabin was a canyon of person to see that Arafat was a revolutionary and not a governor. That Arafat knew how to lead a kind of a terrorist group or a militant movement, but once he was charged with running an entity, if you could call those zones in the West Bank an entity, a Palestinian Authority, he didn't really know how to do that.
Postscript to the Arafat uniform story is, of course, after the funeral, when Arafat came to visit Leah Rabin at her home, he wore a suit. And it's one of the only photographs you'll see of Arafat without a keffiyeh, without his uniforms, in their living room. And he's almost unrecognizable, but he's also deeply moved to be there. And it's a pretty humane capture of that moment. Roy, please.
Your book, Arab and Jew, was required reading in a class I taught
Oh, good, thank
in
you.
high school.
Yeah.
And they found it really compelling and felt like it portrayed a lot of complexity. And when I heard you were here tonight, I was going to tell you that.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
You know, Roy, I wanted to ask David about that book too. David's written several new prefaces, introductions to reissues of the paperback book over the decades. How many?
Two. I've done 2 revised editions.
Okay.
And what they involved was a new preface, yes, but also postscripts to each chapter were relevant. I went into the main body of the book a little bit to update some things where they could be done, easily. But I didn't re-report everything. It would have been another 4-year project. I did that a couple, two editions. The last edition came out 10 years ago. So there's nothing, now, I don't know what I would do now. I would probably have to start all over again. I think the Gaza war has really, I don't think it's obliterated all of my research from before, but a friend of mine, an Israeli friend of mine, when I said I was going back to do a revised edition, emailed me and said, all you have to do is write something, a sentence in the beginning that says, nothing's changed, it's just gotten worse. So I think
reading one of your most recent blog reports in the Shipler Report on Israel, I'm thinking about your September entry, and for you as an observer of the scene, something fundamental has shifted in Israel post October 7th. And I wonder if you could draw some kind of line between the death of Oslo, the death of Rabin, and which was some inflection point, some radical change in the trajectory of where things were going, and how about Israel's response to October 7th?
This is a long conversation. Well, first of all, I think it's fair to say, and this is kind of a truism, that both sides have radicalized each other. And that the Oslo period was now, when you look at the whole scope of the history of the conflict, a very transitory moment. It was hopeful, but also only tentatively hopeful.
Right.
I mean, I went back a whole bunch of times. I was there from 1979 to 1984 with the Times, and I went back to do a documentary for PBS, and then I went back to do a second documentary for PBS and update my book, and I kept going back, and I kept asking the same questions in some situations. So, for example, one of the things I liked to do, and this does get to your question, is to visit high schools and meet with small groups of juniors and seniors.
In Israel.
Both in Israel and on the West Bank, and Israeli Arab schools. Okay, so Israeli Jewish, Israeli Arab, West Bank. I like the age kid because they're still carrying their parents' views, but they're beginning to have their own.
They're open in a way they're not going to be 4 years later.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an openness.
It's
and
a,
that's
yeah,
part of
it's
it.
a time of turbulence almost, rethinking and I asked, one of the questions that I asked these groups over the years was, who are the victims? And the Israeli kids all said, we are, except for one girl who said, we're both victims. The Palestinian kids in Ramallah all said, we are, except for one girl who said, we're both victims. And I think that, and that didn't really change very much over time. But what did change was in between that kind of questioning, there was a hardness in the answers and a fear on both sides that began to become more and more obvious as the years went on. The Palestinian kids, after Oslo and the Palestinian Authority took over, certain areas of the West Bank and had its, own media, propaganda and stuff, started to say things that I had not heard when I lived there. And one of the things that they said which was really striking to me, and it happened actually in a Christian school in the West Bank where I went to visit. And a Palestinian girl said, well, there was never a Jewish temple in Jerusalem. That's just made up by the Jews so they could claim Jerusalem. And I had never heard that before all the years that I lived there. She was wearing a little cross. So I said to her, oh, so the New Testament is wrong about Jesus throwing the money changers out of the temple? And she said, oh, I'll have to think about that. But that idea that there was no Jewish temple spread, and it became widespread. I'm a father. And it became now, it's now, a commonly held view among Palestinians. And it goes right to the heart of Jewish identity and belonging in that place. And I think on the Israeli side too, we've seen I remember I was there, one of the later times I was there, I was up on somewhere, and there was a guide, a tourist guide, and it was a place where you could overlook Jerusalem, and you could see the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa, and this Israeli guide said, of course, the Arabs weren't here, they just come lately. Thinking, wow, this is like everybody's denying everyone else's history, because history is so powerful that you can't accept it as part of the narrative without a lot of other things happening in terms of your attitudes. I mean, the historical narrative is really critical in governing the conflict. So I think that, when the radicals killed Oslo, Hamas and the suicide bombings and that all happened, as the play indicates, in the midst of this effort to try to make it work, and certainly that was the context in which Rabin was assassinated. One thing the play didn't do enough of, I don't think, is have some of the rabbis, the settler rabbis who were promoting, and who figured out some kind of and I can't remember the term.
Pulitzer.
Yeah, where under Jewish law that it's okay to kill to save the Jewish people.
It's there in the play.
It is? What do I mean?
There's 2 seconds. We may have done a cut or two where you used to see the prayer shawls and the moving, the davening, the shuffling back and forth, where there was an incantation of that curse, that priestly curse against them. So we may have shortchanged that visualization.
And you have the American rabbi.
We do mention the American rabbi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But just to bring it up, you asked about the Gaza war. I think Israel has forfeited its moral authority. I'll just put it plainly. And that's a huge thing to give up for a small state, no matter how militarily powerful. It depends on international support. Look who just got elected mayor of New York. There is a very powerful anti-Israel feeling now in the United States and in Europe. It's not all anti-Semitism, although some of it is. And I think that both the opponents of Israel and the supporters of Israel have made a huge mistake in blurring the lines between criticism of Israel and criticism of Jews generally. All Jews are not responsible for Israel's offenses. And all those who criticize Israel for its offenses are not criticizing all Jews. But that line has really been blurred, and it's a very dangerous thing to have happened.
Mm.
But what Israel did in Gaza was completely unforgivable. It adds to what I've often thought of as the arsenal of memory in that part of the world. It will never be forgotten. Never be forgotten. Ever. It looms.
We won't forget it either, because we saw it every day.
It looms
Bombing.
larger than, this excerpt that they censored from Rabin, that's child's play compared to what Israel's just done. I mean, that expulsion, which, the Palestinians have exaggerated, because they've argued that all of the Palestinians who left in 48 were expelled, all 800,000 or whatever. That's not the case. But that's part of their historical narrative. Well, they have
This is a bigger knock.
This is a much bigger catastrophe for Palestinians. It's never going to be forgotten. Now, how do you make peace in that kind of a situation? Well, I don't know, but I think the people around the negotiating tables.
Well, the catastrophe, they're certainly not symmetrical catastrophes, but Israel never suffered a catastrophe like they did on October 7th.
That's right.
And that
Yeah.
helps to recontext a post-genocidal reckoning, because both sides have to reckon with what they committed, with the atrocities that they committed. And the Palestinians are not innocent, in that regard. And the Israelis have a tremendous amount to reckon with themselves.
No, the trauma that was inflicted upon Israel on October 7th is deep and lasting. It also won't be forgotten. So I think that, these wounds are hard to heal. I don't think they can be papered over very easily. I was going to say that the people who sit around negotiating tables talk about borders, security guarantees, diplomatic relations, commercial relations. Maybe they get to sharing Jerusalem, as Ehud Barak, kind of tried to do. Arafat couldn't go there because it was kind of sprung on him without warning. I think Aaron David Miller wrote in his book about how Barak didn't even let the U.S. know he was going to propose sharing Jerusalem. So the U.S. couldn't go out into the Muslim world and say, hey, what do you think about this? So anyway, you got to kind of lay the groundwork for this sort of thing. And I think that basically what has to happen is there are two things that have to happen that negotiators haven't been able to get at. One is that both sides have to figure out how to share Jerusalem. And the other is both sides have to give up their right of return. So the Palestinians have to give up their right of return to pre-48 Palestine. And the Israeli Jews have to give up their right of return.
The law of return. Their law.
The law of return, the right of return, whatever you want to call it, they have to give it up to Judea and Samaria. The other thing that happened over the years, by the way, on the Palestinian side, besides the temple denial, was an increasing emphasis on return. And I remember the first time this really struck me was when I was living there. I was, I don't know, must have been maybe 1980, 81, something like that. I was in Gaza. I was in the Jabalia refugee camp, sitting around with a bunch of guys who were maybe in their early 20s. And a kid came in, 12-year-old kid, from 1912. And one of the guys said to the kid, "Where are you from?" The kid said, "I'm from Barbarit." I said, Barbarit, where's Barbarit? They all kind of laughed. I said, well, Barbarit, it's an Arab village up the coast near Ashkelon. Hasn't existed since 1948. This kid was born in Gaza. His father was probably born in Gaza. His children, if he survived, have been born in Gaza. But where was he from? Barbarit. And over the years, that idea of return became more and more pronounced. Every time I went back, I heard it more and more. Last time was in this school in Ramallah, and my interpreter, who was a Palestinian American, wonderful guy, and he had a real knack and an instinct. He said, let's ask the kids where they're from to begin with. So it was kind of an odd question. We were in Ramallah. So we went around the room, and they said things like, I'm from Jaffa, living in Ramallah.
I was
If you go to the, there's a community center in the Haitian refugee camp, near Bethlehem, which was built with Saudi money. Each room is named after an Arab village in pre-48 Israel, what is now Israel. One of them is Zachariah. And Zachariah is now a Jewish town. And was a wonderful guy, and a wonderful Israeli Peace Now guy who had named Morley Baron. And Morley told me that he actually had expelled Palestinians from Zachariah during the 48 war. He was active in Peace Now. He was really, he was a very, very, he went around the States for a while with, I think, Mohammed Milham, who had been a mayor of Khalkhul in the West Bank, and they did sort of joint presentations. But Morley said, I felt bad about expelling the Palestinians. I'm not sure it was the wrong thing to do. So this is these are sort of these complicated internal feelings that people live with about that history. It's also, by the way, I should add, to forget this is completely wrong. I mean, the withdrawal from Gaza that Sharon did was, a turning point in terms of Israelis' views, because as soon as Hamas took over, the whole idea of land for peace, just disappeared. I mean, that whole concept of we give up land, we're going to get peace, obviously not. They got rockets instead of peace. Now, Ariel Sharon, I just want to say a word about Sharon, because Sharon also was a somewhat misunderstood character. So I got to know Sharon. Now, he's a guy I got to know, actually, more than Rabin. The first time I met Sharon was, I just arrived, I was just traveling around with our photographer, Micha Maram. We were on the West Bank. We went to a settlement named Elon Moreh. Now, Elon Moreh was an illegal settlement. It's now moved and become legal, but it was an illegal settlement with caravans and and at that time Sharon was the agriculture minister, responsible for infrastructure. So I'm there and I'm talking to a couple of settlers. They were Gush Emunim settlers who were talking about how God gave Abraham and his seed deed to the land, and it's in Genesis, and that was their whole argument, basically. All of a sudden, Sharon drives up in a Jeep, he and an army Jeep. They come in to visit the settlers, and Sharon, sees the New York I had never met him before, and I introduced myself, and sees the New York Times correspondent there, and decides he'd rather talk to me than the settlers. And so he gives his whole explanation for the settlements. It was a very clear day. We were high, and you could see down to the Arava, you could see in misty, kind of suggestion, the coastal plain near the Mediterranean. Sharon unrolled map a map on the hood of his Jeep. He
Right.
was one of these guys he was a consummate general. He could look at a topographical map and envision it in 3 dimensions. And his whole case was about the conventional military argument. That, look, this wadi here, you see this wadi here, Iraqi tanks, armored units can come through Jordan and come right up and go right to the coastal plain. And when you have settlements, and you have children who grow up knowing every wadi and every hill and every spring, they'll think it's theirs and they'll defend it. And that's why we have the settlements. So he did not mention Genesis. He did not mention God. He did not mention Abraham. He was the pragmatic general. Now, he was ruthless. He was very, he was very cruel to Arabs, both civilians and military. But he was basically, I think, a thinker in conventional military terms. And for him, Gaza was not important militarily. So when he was prime minister and withdrew from Gaza unilaterally, no agreement, just
Right.
I was not surprised actually. A lot of people were, what on earth? This guy is a hardline extreme hawk. I wasn't surprised because for him it was a liability. It wasn't an asset. It wasn't a military asset. But what a mistake not to do it in the context of some agreement, international supervision, some protection of Israeli security interests. I mean, I'm sure Sharon never anticipated Hamas would, use it as a weapons depot and an armed camp the way they did. So he really was wrong in that case. But politically, it was devastating because it radicalized large parts of the Israeli population. They figured they couldn't trust the Arabs, and Gaza. I mean, you've all been there. Have you all been there? Well, if you go there, the first thing that struck me when I went there was the proximity of everything. I mean, the West Bank is just down the street.
Right.
I mean, the idea of a Palestinian state on the West Bank after what happened in Gaza is terrifying to Israelis. And I think that, I think probably the vast majority of Israelis, even my liberal friends, and I have many there, who would love to see a resolution of this, have a certain anxiety about it. Actually.
Well, I think we've had a very intimate and wonderful opportunity to hear
Quite
David
right, thank
Shipler
you.
unplugged
It's
today.
really interesting.
It's great to hear your thoughts about Rabin, about Israel then and now, and all we can do is invoke the same, hopes and prayers for peace and a hope for new realities to assert itself in the wake of catastrophe.
I will say the Gaza plan is really good, Trump's plan.
It's funny, I was about to ask you where you think we're going now.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of ifs in that, if it can be implemented. It's very aspirational and very general.
Sure.
A lot of the provisions are quite non-specific. And of course, Netanyahu basically rejected one of the principles hours after he said he accepted it, which was creating conditions that might lead to a path to a two-state solution. I mean, but it's a good plan, actually. I mean, if it were implemented, and the fact that the Security Council approved the international force is a really good step. But making it happen is really going to be difficult.
Well, let's thank our guest, David Shipler. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.